Well, welcome everyone. We are here with Dr. James R. White, and we're very excited because we finally have some of Dr. White's books in accordance. And these have been requested for a long time. I've wanted to see these here for a long time, and this is the beginning of what will hopefully be a much larger library of his. And so he was gracious enough to sit here with us for a moment and kind of give us a overview of all of all five of the books that we have released in accordance. So thank you for being here, Dr. White.
It's great to be with you. I've always loved my Accordance Bible software. Everybody who watches my program knows that it's my go-to and what I use to display Greek, Hebrew, textual critical materials, everything else. So it's wonderful to have those books in the library.
Yeah, we're very excited. I thought I would just run through these. There's five of them that's in the initial release, and maybe you could give a summary of those books. So the first one that I have here pulled up in accordance on my screen is The Forgotten Trinity. Can you give us an overview of just a quick overview of The Forgotten Trinity?
Well, when people read that book, many of them will write to me and they will use a particular phrase that I used in the book, and that is, I love the Trinity, because I started off by saying, you never hear anybody say that. You hear people say, I love prophecy, I love the doctrine of justification. You don't hear them say, I love the Trinity, because most people don't really understand it. They don't understand what's really being asserted, and they don't understand the centrality of the Trinity to all the rest of Christian theology.
Right.
And so the book is intended for believers to ground them in the biblical foundations. Now, obviously, I'm an apologist, so I've defended the Trinity in mosques around the world and against Unitarians and Mormons in Salt Lake City and everything else. But so there's always the apologetic aspect. But I really did want to allow Christian believers to see the foundation, see why it's relevant, make the connection between that central organizing reality of Christian theology and all the rest of Christian theology. So, yeah, that book's been around for, we just did a second edition, I think, just a couple of years ago. And you've got the new edition in there. And so it's been really helpful to a lot of folks.
Another book that we have is The God Who Justifies, and this is one of your better known books for certain.
Actually, what's interesting is the Trinity book and my King James book are probably best known, along with one other that you have, which we'll talk about here in a second.
Right. I know which
The
one
God
you're
Who
talking about.
Justifies is really meant again for there are lots. There's a huge amount of material on the doctrine of justification, new perspectivism, Tom Wright, everything else these days, but there's not a lot that's modern that really seeks to be firmly biblical with a high view of the inerrancy of Scripture and the consistency of Scripture, and again making application. And so in that particular book, the first, as I recall, 8 chapters are really application, why it's important. I'm been teaching church history since 1990, so I had to throw some church history in there for the fun of it. But then it gets fairly exegetically deep, because I go through the key texts and do so rather deeply. And my understanding is that in accordance, you can, unlike a paper edition or even a Kindle version, you can search on all sorts of aspects of the original languages and everything else along those lines. So that's what really makes the Accordance version really valuable to someone who may already have even the hardback. It's the only hardback I've ever had. Hey, but still, in the paper version, you can't search the way that you can in Accordance, and so I think folks will find that to be really, really useful and helpful.
All right, I believe that the book that you alluded to a moment ago is Scripture Alone.
Actually, no.
No, okay.
Actually, my second best selling book and most popular book is Grieving Your Path Back to Peace.
Really?
And
that's interesting.
We have that in Accordance, and I'll just tell you, we'll go ahead and cover that one.
Yeah, go ahead and tell us about that.
Scripture Alone. They were passing Grieving out by the box load on September 13th in New York of 2001 at Ground Zero
Wow.
to the first responders. And no other book that I've ever written have I had numerous people contact me in the years since it was published to tell me that that book kept them from committing suicide.
Wow.
So it's a small book. It came out of a really difficult period in my life where I worked for a number of years as a hospital chaplain in a non-religious context. I did the loss support group. I was thrown into this without almost any experience whatsoever. Like I said, it was some of the hardest work I ever did. And I tell the story at the beginning of the book of what prompted the writing of it was the loss of an acquaintance of mine. His 29-day-old granddaughter passed away when her mother had an epileptic seizure, rolled over on top of her and suffocated her. And so, it's had a life of its own. It has been so useful, and we just 3 days ago lost a 43-year-old mother in our church. The funeral is still coming up, and we're passing that book around. And a lot of pastors buy it by the carton and just leave it in the office because it's not something you give somebody the day after a death. Right. Because everyone's in shock at that point in time. They don't want to be reading books. It's about a 2-month, 3-month down the road thing. It's extremely practical. It's not a theology of death. It's not 400 pages long. It's we don't talk about grieving in the church much.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah. And so we don't know how to prepare for it. We as Christians should be prepared for it. But I learned a long time ago, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. And so I learned a lot in those years and tried to put it all down in that little book in a really practical thing. And it's just really helped a lot of people. So I don't think the search features are going to be all that helpful in that situation. But it's probably the most practical book I've ever written. And just to give your audience a little background, it almost didn't get published because when I gave it to my acquisitions editor at Bethany House, I had already written the King James only controversy and the Roman Catholic controversy. Half of my titles had controversy somewhere in the title. And he read it and he loved it. And he said, I'm going to bring this in house, but I'm taking your name off it. And I'm like, what? And he's like, it'll never get a fair read if your name is on it at first. And so he brought it in house. They read it, said, we want it. Who wrote it? And then he tells them, and they're like, oh, what are we going to do with this? And so they did struggle, because of the other stuff that I've written. People in their minds don't think that someone who's done 175 moderated public debates around the world is going to have anything meaningful to say. I can't have a heart, obviously. I can't be a human being, I guess, or a pastor, as I have been for decades and everything else. So
that happened with C.S. Lewis, though, right? He had written The Problem of Pain from an apologist perspective, but later he writes A Grief Observed, and they didn't put his name on it at first. They actually published it under a pseudonym, and then everyone figured out it was C.S. Lewis, and so any edition you buy now has his name on it. What I think that I don't know how many people are going to pull up Accordance on their Windows or Mac computer, and you never know. They might, but I think what this could be very helpful for our users is all the pastors that we have that can read this book and again searching through it and so forth, but can read this book and use these elements that you've got here to help those who are in the grieving process. Again, perhaps give them the physical book or something like that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, most people are really surprised. That's my second most popular book.
I'm surprised by that. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's go then to Scripture Alone. Tell us about Scripture Alone, because this is one you're fairly well known for as well.
Right. Well, and that's because the subject of scriptural sufficiency, sola scriptura, the first debate that I did in August of 1990 in Long Beach, California, was on sola scriptura, and so it's It's a subject that I have been engaged with for a very, very long time. And pretty much every group that I dealt with for many, many years, the centrality of Scripture, the accuracy of Scripture, the transmission of Scripture was very much central to all of that. And so, again, not meant to be 700 pages long, but meant to communicate on a popular level and yet accurately, so that people can have an understanding. I mean, Bart Ehrman's put a bunch of books out, and
Right.
you could write a response to every single one of them, undoubtedly. But most people need to have that foundational understanding of where did the canon come from? How do we deal with alleged contradictions? Why do we believe that this particular collection of ancient books is sufficient in and of itself to reveal to us what God's intention for our lives is, especially in light of all the challenges of the modern world? And so, even though it's not a brand new book, the issues don't change over
Right.
time. They really, really don't. And so, in fact, I'll be teaching at Grace Bible Theological Seminary in February, where I just became professor of church history and apologetics. And that's one of the texts I'll be using there, because it addresses a wide variety of issues and remains relevant along those lines. So, yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that, it's not 700 pages. I just looked here in accordance, because we include the page numbers. It's a little bit over 200 pages. So someone could take this, get very much up to speed on the subject. And I think a lot of these books, we still have one more to cover here, but I think a lot of these books are perfect reading on our mobile apps. You pick up an iPad or something like that, and just these will work really, really well on them. Let's talk about your book, the Quran, or what every Christian needs to know about the Quran is the actual
Right.
title. We have it named a little bit funny there in the tab, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's that really is a rather full introduction to Islam as a whole, the theology of Islam. I just use the Quran as sort of an organizing template, in essence. It's not just about the Quran, but it's about what the Quran teaches.
Sure.
Specifically about Christians and the doctrine of the Trinity and what salvation is. But I use the Quran because for any Orthodox Muslim, that is the essence of God's revelation to man. It's the final revelation to man, is the Quran. And so, since we are addressed, the Al-Injil, the people of the gospel, the Al-Kitab, the people of the book, we are addressed in the Quran numerous times. And it's fascinating how few Christians have any idea what the Quran says to us.
Right.
And it's amazing the doors that will be opened when, in speaking to a Muslim, you recognize that their book addresses you and you've taken the time to listen to that. Talk about opening opportunities to conversation. I've never had a problem anywhere in the world getting a conversation going with a Muslim, because I've taken the time to show them the respect to learn about their faith. And you will learn about pretty much every aspect of Islamic belief that is relevant to the Christian, and it's going to be relevant to your conversation with the Muslim, is going to be covered at some point or another in that book. And that is a longer book. That there's a lot more content there. And in all of my books, especially the Trinity book and the Quran book, I put a lot of the other stuff into the text in the justification book. But on Trinity and Quran, if you don't read the notes, you're missing some of the best material in the book. So obviously, it's much easier to get to in the electronic version than in paper. If I recall correctly, the justification book had the notes on the page. I actually begged them for that. But so many publishers just don't want to do that. They don't like the look of the page, and so you're having to sit there do the flip thing.
Yeah, I hate flipping back and forth in a book. I love the footnotes.
Yeah, and believe me, most of us authors would rather have it there too.
Right.
But the publisher says, not so much. So yeah, there you go.
Well, it was kind of a controversial thing when, or at least for us, it was when we first released a Arabic tagged Quran and then some translations,
which I have.
But we did that on the request of missionaries. who
Right.
are out in the field and wanted to have a text in accordance, and we had never done anything like that. It was, we kind of span, the theological spectrum from left to right, but we had never done anything like that with another religion. And
Mhm.
so, and we weren't sure what the response would be, but the response was very good,
Mhm.
in that it's very helpful to people who are having these conversations that you describe. And I think that your book will be one more tool to go along with some of this content that we've already published.
I haven't looked at it yet, and maybe this didn't happen, but boy, it would be great if it could. It would be really neat if the tags went to the Quran.
I believe
Um,
they do. I'm looking at it right
that's
now.
awesome.
In fact,
Yeah.
I'll put it up on the screen when we release this video.
Okay.
But yeah, you
Okay.
can you mouse over any of the references to the Quran and they show up in instant details. You can click on
Wow.
it and it'll show up right there. And I believe the way it works is, like, if you have Quran modules, whether it's in Arabic or whether it's in English, it will default to whichever one is on top in your list in your library. And so if you want it to always default to the English, you can put that one up a little bit higher and it will default to that. But yeah, it's working just as you suggested there. It's everything is
Yeah.
hyperlinked and tagged to it, which again, you can't do that with a Kindle book at
No,
all.
no. And I grabbed your cron stuff as soon as I saw it. I was like, oh, that's
Yeah.
perfect. That's awesome. That's for me especially very, very useful. So that's awesome. That is really good to know.
Yeah. Well, Dr. White, I appreciate you taking your time to talk with us this morning, and I hope this is just the first of more conversations we can have as we release more content in the days to come. And we thank you for your work and your support of Accordance Bible software.
Well, thank you for producing the best Bible software out there. I'm going to keep using it and keep directing everybody to it.
Thank you very much.